Hey everyone, it's Carissa Wiley here for ellenhudson.com. Thanks for joining me today. Today I am sharing 3 card ideas featuring one stamp set. This is the You Should Know stamp set. Spring is in full bloom here in California. I hope it's starting to warm up where you're at, and so I thought it was a perfect time to bust out the florals. Now, I knew I wanted to create something kind of spring themed for these projects this month, but I wasn't quite sure if everybody saw spring the way that I saw spring. So I went to Instagram and I did a little question box and I said, what makes you think of spring when you think of card making and spring? And everybody said florals. Not everybody, but a lot of people said florals. And so I thought I would pull out this You Should Know stamp set. And I'm going to create 3 different cards, all featuring a little bit different coloring technique. So the first technique that I'm going to use is actually a no-line coloring technique. So I started out with the Distress ink in Antique Linen. This is regular Distress ink. It is not oxide ink. And I inked up my stamp and stamped it onto some Neenah Solar White Heavyweight cardstock. Now that was a little dark for my liking. So I got a new piece of paper and I inked it up again in the Antique Linen Distress ink, and I stamped it off onto a scrap piece of paper, and I'm using my Misty tool to stamp this onto my cardstock. Now this wasn't quite dark enough for me to see, so I'm going to ink it up again in the Antique Linen Distress ink, and I'm going to stamp it off on a piece of scrap paper again, and I'm going to stamp it in the exact same spot as I did before. I don't know if I have issues with contrast and seeing, but I feel like some things that people can see, I don't see well. I like contrast. That's all there is to it. So now I'm coming in with some copic markers and I am coloring one flat color on each of these flowers, and I'm using a dark green for the leaves. I did pick out a color palette before I started and I had all my copic markers ready. And I decided to create this no-line coloring technique with colored pencils to add my shading and darker areas. Now, I find copic markers to be intimidating at times, but using them to lay down some flat color across my image and then coming in with some colored pencils that are in the same color family and a little bit darker really is a great way to add shading to a project. And let me just tell you, I was not sure about this technique. I am not like an expert colorer. I do not consider myself to be super talented at coloring, but this came together really easily. The colored pencils allowed me to add some shading and depth to the image and not make it too complicated. By the way, I am using Polychromos colored pencils today. They are a great colored pencil. And I will have all the colors that I used in the copic markers as well as the Polychromos pencils listed over at the coordinating ellenhudson.com blog post, so that will be linked in the YouTube description. Now, once I have this colored, I am using my scissors to fussy cut this out, and you can see I'm actually turning the paper, not my scissors, to get into these tight areas. So now that my image is colored and cut out, I am going to create a card front, and I have die cut some Essentials by Ellen linen cardstock using the Essential Rectangles die. And now I am lining up the Skinny Stripes die on top of that to create a little bit of texture and interest on this card panel. And you can see off to the right there, I've also die cut the instant photo frames from the Essentials by Ellen line. I've die cut it twice out of heavyweight Neenah Solar White cardstock and once out of some ivory cardstock from Hero Arts. So once I've run this through my die cut machine, you can see I can pop out all these little stripes. Now I can use those little strips for another project, or I can throw them away, which truth be told, that's what I did. Sometimes if I try to save too many scraps, I never know what I have anyway. So now I'm going to stack up my photo frames, and I'm using a little bit of Lawn Fawn glue tube to stack these on top of each other and give them a little bit of dimension. And I'm just kind of creating this collage effect of different textures and die cuts to create a grouping for the front of my card. So I have the 2 white cardstock pieces stacked on top of each other, and I'm going to finish it off with the ivory cardstock. This is just going to give it a little bit of contrast but not bring in a whole lot of extra color. So it's another neutral that I can use that will stand off from the white card front that I'm using, but not in a way that's too ostentatious or over the top. It's just, it kind of gives you a white on white effect without it being true white. I hope that makes sense. Now I'm taking a copic marker and I'm coloring in the open areas on this piece that I cut out just to bring in a little bit of this mint color to my color palette. And I cannot get over how this colored image turned out. I really do love it. So now I have my card base. This is a top folding A2 size card base created from some Essentials by Ellen linen cardstock. And I'm blending on some Catherine Pooler meant to be ink with a blending brush. And I've just used a little bit of painter's tape to tape off my edges so that I don't go outside of the area that this card front is going to cover. And once I have that ink blended on, I can add some foam adhesive to the back of my card front and I can stack that on top of my card base to give it some dimension. Now I'm just going to arrange my remaining pieces. I added the photo frame on to the card front using some liquid adhesive. And my flower cluster I added on using some foam adhesive. Now for my sentiment, I thought it would be a great idea to get a head start on some Mother's Day cards. If you haven't started them, it's going to sneak up on you and it's going to catch you, so you better start them now. So I grabbed a couple of sentiments. I have a sentiment from the Totally Random Sayings Volume 3 that I heat embossed on some vellum using some gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. And I have the word mom. Now this is from the Everyday Hero Lady Leading Ladies stamp set from Essentials by Ellen. And I've just stamped that using some Versamark ink onto the bottom of my instant frame there. I added some gilded embossing powder and now I'm heat setting that. Now this love you actually says I love you in its original design, and several months back I cut it down to where I could just use it as love you instead of I love you, and so that's what I've used today. And I'm just gluing that vellum on there with a little bit of liquid adhesive hidden behind my embossed sentiment. I added some sparkling clear sequins to finish this off, and that is my first card for today. Now, my first card featured no line coloring, and we're going to go in the complete opposite direction for the second card, and we're going to be doing the no coloring coloring technique. Sometimes I like to do this because I'm not always in the mood to color, truth be told. So I have a piece of Neenah Solar White cardstock. It's cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I have that loaded into my Misty tool. And I am stamping this stamp using some Gina K Obsidian Amalgam ink. And I do have a little stamping tool that someone created for me and sent to me so that I could use it to achieve even pressure across the stamp. But you could also use like a Swiffer cloth or a microfiber cloth or your sleeve, as I've often done, to kind of glide your hand over the surface of your Misty. Now I wanted to create some colored stripes on the front of this card. And I thought the best way to do this, rather than pull out a bunch of cardstock and try to match up my colors, was just to use the Copic colors that I already had out. So I have a piece of Neenah Solar White cardstock, and I'm just creating some lines of color using the Copic markers that I used in my last card project. And once I get the color laid down, I'm going to take these over to my trimmer, and I'm going to trim these down into 1/4 inch strips. Now it's important when you're creating a card where you're not actually coloring the focal image that you do bring some color in somewhere. And this method of just using some stripes, some colorful strips of pattern paper, or something like that is one of my favorite ways to just bring in some areas of color. So you can see I'm taking this over to my trimmer and I'm trimming these down. I added those pinks all right up next to each other. It didn't really matter. I just kind of cut between them. And then I'm going to take some liquid adhesive and adhere these down at an angle. An angle just tends to be a little bit more forgiving than trying to go straight across the card project, because if you get the first one off, they all go wonky and then you got yourself a crazy not straight mess going on. So I will often use an angle. I've also used the Painted Stripes stamp set from the Essentials by Ellen line in the past to add these stripes of color across my focal image. Another idea would be the Abstract Paint Strokes stamp set from the Essentials by Ellen. Those are all great ways to add a little bit of color, quick color, to your focal image if you're not going to be doing some intentional coloring of your image. Does that make sense? So now I've flipped this over and I've trimmed off the excess, and I'm going to put this back into my MISTI. I had left my stamp exactly where it was on the lid of my MISTI. And now I'm going to use the Gina K Obsidian Amalgam ink again to stamp over the area that I placed my colorful strips on. Now the reason that I stamped it first and then added the strips and then I'm stamping it again is because although those paper strips are very thin, they do add some dimension to that area. So if I added the strips first and then stamped over the top, there would be a gap in the stamping between the base of the card and the colorful stripes that are on top. So I would recommend stamping your image first, adding your strips of cardstock, and then stamping again over the top of that area. Now I have moved my stamp and repositioned it, and I am going to kind of fill in the bottom area of this card with a little more stamping. I'm using the Gina K Obsidian ink again. And once I get that stamped into place, I'm going to actually rotate my MISTI because it's easier for me to push this up into that upper left-hand corner rather than the upper right-hand corner and allow this floral piece to come off the lower right-hand corner. So it's just a matter of positioning for me of my stamp and where I need my cardstock to be. Because I am stamping this more than one time each time, I'm stamping twice for each image, I want to make sure that I can keep my cardstock pushed up into a corner to make sure that those images are stamped in the exact same spot. Now I'm using one of the Essentials by Ellen Essential Rectangles to die cut this panel, and I'm going to run this through my Gemini Junior, and it cut through this no problem because I did use an 80-pound cardstock for those colorful stripes that I created using my Copic markers. And you can see I am left with the rectangle and the frame as well, and I will use both of those pieces on my final card. Now I am using a lot of the same elements on each of these cards. So I have die cut 3 frames again using that instant photo frame die from the Essentials by Ellen line. And I'm using the Love You Mom sentiment again, but this time I'm just stamping all of it onto that instant photo frame in some Gina K Amalgam ink. And I am going to add a little heart. This heart stamp and die are from the All Inside stamp and die set from the Essentials by Ellen line. And this is just going to bring a little more color up to the front of that frame because the frame going over the top of this floral image did kind of take away from some of that color that I was getting showing through. And so I adhered that all onto a top folding A2 size card base and finished it off with a little bit of tonic aqua shimmer pin and some sparkling clear sequins, and that's my second card. So moving on to my third card, I actually have some Ranger watercolor cardstock loaded into my MISTI, and I'm going to do a little watercoloring for this image for my third way to color this image. So I have stamped that twice onto this watercolor cardstock, and I am going to heat set it. I did use the Gina K Obsidian Amalgam ink again. I want to make sure that this is good and dry before I start using some water and water-based inks on top of this image. Now to watercolor this, I'm actually going to use a variety of dye inks. Mostly these are Catherine Pooler inks. I get really great results when I watercolor with Catherine Pooler inks. I also have the Ballet Slipper ink from Concord and Ninth. Now this ink is not as forgiving when you watercolor with it, but you can totally make it work. Next up, I have some Catherine Pooler Deck the Halls, the Meant to Be. I also use Catherine Pooler Lemongrass for that bright green yellow, and all of these ink colors inspired the Copic markers and colored pencils that I chose earlier. So you can see I'm just using a wet paintbrush and picking up some of the ink off of the lid of the ink pad, adding it onto my image, and then I'm heat setting that, and then I die cut that using another Essentials by Ellen Essential Rectangle die. Now I'm once again using the stacked up photo frames, but this time I'm stamping the word amazing above the word mom. I kind of allowed these stamped sentiments to overlap each other just a little bit because I wanted that alignment. And once I get that adhered onto my card front, I die cut this little arrow from the Instant Photo Frame die set, And once again, I'm just using the heart from the All Inside stamp and die set to add another little element there, and I will finish that off with some Tonic Aqua Shimmer Pen. Now, I did adhere all of these card fronts onto my card base using some foam adhesive to add a little more dimension. If you don't want that much dimension on your card, you can always forego the foam adhesive, but you know me, I like big cards. I just like them big. I can't help it. I like them big. I like them chunky when it comes to cards. And once again, I finished that off with some sparkling clear sequins, and using that amazing mom sentiment allows me to give that to a friend on Mother's Day instead of my own mom, because the others say, love you, mom. So there you have it. Spring is in bloom, spring has sprung, and you have 3 different ways that you can use this You Should Know stamp set for some spring cards. These are Mother's Day inspired cards, but they are absolutely perfect for a thank you card, a happy birthday card, a baby card, a wedding card. Just change up the sentiment. This can be anything you want. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised with how these cards turned out. I love the color palette. I especially love the way this no line coloring card turned out. This was actually the one that sparked all of the other ideas. And so I hope you enjoyed watching me create these cards and that they've inspired you to create something kind of in that spring spirit. As always, I will have links to the featured products used in these projects in the description at YouTube. But if you're looking for more details, more still shots, more information, and a complete list of supplies, be sure you head on over to the ellenhudson.com blog. I will have it linked below. Over there, you'll find a lot more information, including all of the Copic marker colors that I used and the polychromos colored pencils that I used. So if you're looking for that information, head over there. As always, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications here on the ellenhudson.com YouTube channel so you won't miss any of our paper crafting and card making video tutorials. I'm so glad you chose to spend your valuable time with me here today watching this video. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.